Right now, you are wearing something you didn't think twice about putting on. A shirt, pajamas, maybe just a blanket pulled over your shoulders. It's automatic, the same as breathing. But for most of the time our species has existed, that thing didn't exist. There was no fabric, no thread, no needle, just skin exposed to wind, rain, sun, and cold for hundreds of thousands of years. And then, somewhere in the dark of an ice age, something changed. A piece of animal hide got wrapped around a shoulder for the first time. And from that single moment, the entire trajectory of our species shifted. Why we actually started wearing clothes has almost nothing to do with what you were taught. And the real story starts with something even stranger. The fact that we were naked far longer than we should have been. To understand clothing, you first have to understand fur, because we used to have it. Every other primate on Earth is covered in thick body hair. Chimpanzees, gorillas, every close relative we have. But somewhere around 2 million years ago, our ancestors started losing theirs. Geneticists studying the genes that control skin pigmentation trace this back by looking at when human skin darkened to protect against UV radiation. The estimate they landed on was striking. Somewhere around 1.2 million years ago, our ancestors were already walking around essentially naked. No fur, no clothes, just bare skin. The leading theory is brutal in its simplicity. Early humans were becoming endurance hunters, chasing prey across open savanna in the heat of the day until the animal collapsed from exhaustion. To do that, you need to sweat, and sweating through thick fur doesn't work. So the fur went, the sweat glands multiplied, and the skin darkened to handle the sun beating down on it directly. But here's the problem with that timeline. If we lost our fur 1.2 million years ago and clothing didn't exist yet, that leaves a gap, a massive one. Over 1 million years where our ancestors were naked, furless, exposed, and somehow surviving ice ages, freezing nights, and climates that should have killed them outright. So how do we even know when clothing actually started? You can't dig up fabric from 1 million years ago. It rots. It disappears. It leaves nothing behind. For decades, this was one of the great unanswered questions in human evolution. Then, in 2003, a geneticist named Mark Stoneking found an answer in the last place anyone expected. Lice. Human head lice and human body lice, the kind that live in clothing, are actually two different species, and species split apart at a measurable rate. By comparing the DNA of head lice and clothing lice, Stoneking's team calculated when they diverged from a common ancestor. Clothing lice, it turned out, could only have evolved once there was clothing to live in. The number that came back was around 170,000 years ago, which means there's a gap of roughly 1 million years between losing our fur and putting on the first clothes. 1 million years of bare skin against an ice age world, no fur, no fabric, nothing. And somehow our ancestors didn't just survive that gap, they spread across continents during it. So what changed at the 170,000 year mark? The timing is not a coincidence. That number lines up almost exactly with one of the most brutal glacial periods Africa ever went through. A period so cold and dry it nearly wiped out the human population entirely. Genetic studies suggest the entire ancestral human population may have dropped to just a few thousand individuals during this stretch. An anthropologist named Ian Gilligan spent years studying exactly this question. Not why humans started covering their bodies, but why clothing as a technology appears precisely when it does. His conclusion was blunt. Clothing wasn't invented for modesty, and it wasn't a slow cultural drift. It was a survival response to cold, and it appeared in a sudden burst exactly when the climate turned lethal. But there's a difference between draping a hide over your shoulders and wearing something. A loose hide falls off. It lets in wind. It doesn't trap heat against the skin. For true insulation, the kind that can keep a human alive through an actual ice age, you need clothing that fits. Sealed seams, layers, sleeves, and that requires something our ancestors hadn't needed in over 1 million years of being naked. A needle. Here's where it gets strange. Neanderthals lived in Ice Age Europe for over 300,000 years. They were stockier, more cold adapted than us, with bodies built to retain heat. And archaeologists have found evidence that they used hides, scraped, worked animal skins draped and tied over the body. But here's what they never left behind: an eyed needle. Not one. Across hundreds of Neanderthal sites, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, there is no tool for sewing fitted clothing. Just hide scrapers, tools for preparing loose wraps. Modern humans, arriving later into the same brutal cold, left something completely different behind. The oldest known eyed needle, found in Denisova Cave in Siberia, dates back roughly 50,000 years. Carved from bone with a hole at one end small enough to thread sinew through, that's a sewing needle. That's tailoring. And tailored clothing isn't just warmer, it's warmer by an enormous margin. Layers of fitted fur and hide can extend the range of survivable temperature by dozens of degrees compared to a draped hide. Some researchers now argue this single difference, sewn, layered clothing versus loose wraps, may have been one of the deciding factors in why modern humans were able to push into the coldest parts of Siberia and the Arctic, regions Neanderthals never reached. A needle. not a weapon, not fire. A needle may have helped determine which species made it and which one didn't, but clothing didn't stay purely functional for long. In a cave called Zudzwana in the country of Georgia, archaeologists found something that didn't fit the story at all. Fibers of flax, twisted and processed into thread, dated to around 34,000 years old. Some of those fibers were dyed, turquoise, pink, black, using plant-based pigments. Think about what that means. Within a relatively short window after humans figured out how to keep themselves alive through an ice age using sewn clothing, they were already dyeing it. Coloring something whose only job, supposedly, was to keep you from freezing to death. That's the moment clothing stopped being just a survival tool and became something else entirely. A signal. A way to say something about who you were without speaking a word. Status. Group identity. Maybe even something we'd recognize today as fashion, tens of thousands of years before the word existed. And once that shift happened, clothing was never just about temperature again. Now here's the part that surprises most people, because almost everyone assumes clothing began with shame. The idea that humans covered themselves because nakedness felt wrong, embarrassing, something to hide. That story is everywhere, in religious texts, in art, in how we talk about the invention of clothes. But that's not what the evidence says. When European explorers and missionaries first made contact with isolated societies in places like the Amazon, Papua New Guinea, and parts of Australia and Africa, they encountered groups of people living almost entirely without clothing, and showing no sign of the shame the explorers expected to find. No embarrassment, no instinct to cover up. Daily life simply happened, unclothed the way it always had. It was often the outsiders who reacted with shock, and missionaries who actively introduced the idea that bodies needed to be covered for moral reasons, sometimes imposing clothing on people within a single generation, along with the concept of shame that was supposed to justify it. In other words, the shame didn't create the clothing. For a huge portion of human history, in a huge number of cultures, clothing existed and shame about nakedness simply did not. They weren't linked at all. The connection between nudity and shame, the one most of us assume is basic human nature, looks far more like something that was taught, exported, and enforced, not something we were born with. So if clothing wasn't born from shame, and it started as Ice Age survival gear that turned into identity, what is it doing to us now? It turns out, more than almost anyone realizes. In 2012, researchers at Northwestern University ran an experiment. They gave participants a white coat to wear and had them complete tasks that required careful attention. One group was told the coat was a doctor's lab coat. Another group was told the exact same coat was a painter's smock. The group wearing the doctor's coat performed measurably better, sharper focus, fewer errors, than the group wearing the identical garment labeled as a painter's coat. Same fabric, same fit, same person wearing it. The only thing that changed was what the clothing meant. Researchers called this enclothed cognition, the idea that what you wear doesn't just change how others see you, it changes how your own brain operates. Put on a uniform and you start acting like the role that uniform represents. Put on pajamas and your brain shifts toward rest, even before you're tired. That hide wrapped around a shoulder 170,000 years ago wasn't just keeping someone warm, it was the first object that could change who a person was, just by being worn. So the next time you get dressed, think about what's actually happening. You're not just covering your body, you're activating a piece of technology that's nearly as old as our species, one that was born out of a near extinction event, perfected with a bone needle in Siberia, dyed with plants in a Georgian cave, and stripped of any connection to shame for most of human history until someone decided to put it back. The clothes hanging in your closet aren't neutral. They're carrying 1,000,000 years of being naked, 170,000 years of staying alive, and tens of thousands of years of telling other people who you are before you say a single word. You put it on without thinking. But nothing about it happened by accident.